Welcome back to Boring Owl, where we take history, wrap it in a warm blanket, dim the lights a little, and wander through the quieter corners of the past. So, if you're settling into bed or just coaxing your mind to slow down after a long day, you're in the right place. Let your shoulders sink back into whatever pillow situation you're working with. Take a breath that's just a little slower than usual, and let's drift somewhere foggy, candlelit, and surprisingly expensive. Tonight, we're floating into Victorian London, the version cushioned in velvet, perfumed with imported colognes, and padded by a household staff that definitely knows more about your life than you do. This is the world of people who woke up rich, went to sleep rich, and somehow spent the entire day pretending they weren't thinking about how rich they were. The kind of wealth that lets you glide through life without ever touching anything cold, sharp, or unpleasant, unless, of course, society demanded it, and society usually did. Picture the city outside, fog curling through narrow streets, horse hooves tapping against cobblestone, chimneys exhaling like tired giants. But inside the mansions, it's quiet. Too quiet, honestly. The kind of quiet that makes you wonder if everyone forgot to breathe. Heavy carpets smother footsteps, silk curtains dim the sunshine, and somewhere in the distance, a servant winds a clock because heaven forbid it be allowed to tick audibly in the presence of wealth. Being filthy rich in Victorian London wasn't just about having money, it was about managing it, displaying it, hiding it, performing it, and occasionally suffering under the weight of it, very gracefully, of course. Wealth wasn't a possession, it was a full-time identity, one that came with rules, endless rules. Rules about which fork you were allowed to look at, which cousin you were obligated to ignore, and which invitations you must pretend you never received. We'll peek into their homes, grand, echoing, and sometimes a little haunted-looking. We'll examine their routines, their social games, their carefully curated leisure, and the surprisingly stressful business of staying rich in a society obsessed with class. And as we move from chapter to chapter, the world will unfold slowly, comfortably, like sinking into a deep old armchair that smells faintly of lavender and ambition. So, get cozy. Let your thoughts settle. Let the edges of the day blur out a little. We're heading into wealth Victorian style. Not the kind you win in a lottery, but the kind you inherit along with 10 generations of pressure and a dining room chandelier that could crush a medium-sized horse. Morning arrived slowly in a Victorian mansion, not because the sun was shy, but because most of it never made it past the curtains. Thick velvet swallowed daylight like a bored cat swallowing a moth, leaving the bedroom in a soft, muted glow. It wasn't exactly dark, just peacefully undecided. The kind of gentle dimness that made even time itself hesitate, unsure whether it should be moving forward or politely waiting in the hall. In this silence, the wealthy stirred, not because they woke up naturally, but because someone else had already set the stage for their waking. A servant, trained to move with the stealth of a ghost and the politeness of a diplomat, crept in long before any wealthy eyelids fluttered open. There were rules to this ritual. Don't knock, don't speak, don't breathe too loudly, don't exist more than absolutely necessary. The goal was simple: create the illusion that comfort happened spontaneously, like a gift from the universe, rather than the labor of 20 underpaid human beings. So, the fire was coaxed alive, the curtains were parted just an inch, the bedclothes inspected for wrinkles, and the morning tea placed on a tray with military precision. Then the servant retreated, leaving no trace except for the faint warmth of the fireplace and the faint scent of bergamot drifting through the room. This was how wealth spoke, quietly, efficiently, and through other people's hands. The wealthy sleeper eventually opened their eyes, slowly, languorously, as if waking up too quickly would be considered vulgar. Their first awareness was not of the day ahead, but of the impossibly soft bed beneath them.
Victorian mattresses for the rich weren't simply mattresses, they were hand-stuffed clouds encased in brocade. The pillows were plumped by someone who at that moment was already downstairs polishing silverware with the determination of a person who knew their livelihood depended on the shine. There was no need for alarm clocks. Time was managed by servants and obligations, not ringing bells. Instead, the gentle clink of porcelain on the bedside table served as a silent cue. The day had begun. A hand emerged from under a mountain of blankets, reaching toward the warm cup like a pampered creature stirring from hibernation. The first sip wasn't just tea, it was reassurance. Reassurance that comfort was the natural order of the universe. Reassurance that everything was in its proper place. Reassurance that the household had already sprung into motion on their behalf. Outside the room, the mansion felt both alive and disturbingly controlled. Servants navigated hallways with the precision of clockwork, performing tasks that the wealthy wouldn't even imagine needed doing. Fires were lit, rugs were beaten, water was heated. The kind of chores that kept a house functioning without ever allowing the wealthy to acknowledge they existed. If a wealthy person ever encountered a servant unexpectedly, everyone involved treated it like a minor scandal. The servant apologized, the master pretended not to see, and the house continued to operate under its silent contract. Luxury must never break character. Once the wealthy occupant finished their tea, the day officially began. The bell cord was pulled, a small gesture with enormous consequences. Somewhere in the service quarters, a bell rang with a sharp, authoritative ping, and a servant hurried up the stairs. They entered the room with the expression of someone who lived in the presence of perpetual judgment. The morning greeting was polite, soft, and thoroughly rehearsed. The reply was just as rehearsed, but warmer because the wealthy had been trained to appear gracious even when half awake. The dressing process wasn't simple. It wasn't even quick. It was a full production, with multiple stages and multiple costumes. Undergarments, layers, fastenings, stays, starch, buttons that defied logic, everything came together with the patient cooperation of one or two attendants. Dressing oneself was technically possible, but considered unnecessarily athletic. Why wrestle with fabric when you could stand still and let others do the wrestling?
While dressing commenced, conversation hovered delicately in the air. Servants would usually restrict themselves to factual statements: the weather, the itinerary, which relative had written a letter, nothing that required the wealthy to think too hard before breakfast. The wealthy, in turn, responded with the kind of absent politeness one used when speaking to someone who knew all your embarrassing secrets but was too well trained to mention them. Once dressed, the wealthy moved through the mansion with the relaxed confidence of someone who expected every room to be warm, every chair to be comfortable, and every surface to be dust-free. The breakfast room awaited, stocked with enough food to feed a small village: porridge, fish, eggs, pastries, but naturally only a modest portion would be eaten. The rest existed purely to suggest abundance. A wealthy person couldn't be seen eating meagerly, even if their appetite disagreed. The household staff flowed around them like a quiet current. One poured tea, another opened the newspaper to the correct page. Someone else adjusted the tablecloth even though it wasn't askew. The wealthy nibbled politely while scanning the morning news. War in some distant colony, a scandal involving a duke, a new invention promising to revolutionize transportation. All interesting, but none pressing. The wealthy rarely had problems that required immediate solutions. Their mornings were built on the comfort of distance: distance from hardship, distance from necessity, distance from any task that might cause perspiration. Breakfast also included the inspection of invitations, letters, and social obligations. The Victorian wealthy were basically full-time participants in an elaborate game of polite expectations. Declining an invitation from the wrong person could haunt you for months. Accepting too many could leave you exhausted, in the deeply refined, gently inconvenient way that only upper-class exhaustion could be. Today, perhaps, there would be a luncheon, a fitting, a stroll through the park, or a visit to a friend's drawing room.
Nothing dramatic, just activities that existed purely to make everyone feel important without doing anything of actual consequence. After breakfast, a carriage would be prepared. Not too early, not too late, because arriving at the wrong hour suggested poor breeding. The wealthy stepped into the carriage with the nonchalant elegance of someone who never had to think about how much horses cost, how much stables cost, or how much effort went into preventing manure-related disasters. They simply expected the world to be smooth and the wheels to turn. On the drive, the city unfolded in a way designed to be seen but not touched. Victorian London had many faces: fog drifting over the Thames, lampposts glowing through the haze, shop windows glittering with imported goods. But from the comfort of a carriage, the wealthy experienced only the curated version. Rough streets were avoided, working districts ignored. Poverty filtered out like background noise. The wealthy lived in a city within a city, one paved with expectations rather than cobblestone. The morning route often included a stop at a tailor, jeweler, or exclusive shop, places where purchases weren't merely transactions, but declarations of taste. A new walking stick here, a silk glove there, perhaps a brooch to match a gown. Money flowed easily because wealth wasn't meant to be hoarded. It was meant to circulate in elegant, socially approved ways. Buying things kept the economy of social status humming along. Of course, interacting with shopkeepers was delicate. They were expected to be attentive but not overly familiar, helpful but invisible, efficient but deferential. The wealthy, in turn, were expected to pretend they weren't aware of the power imbalance, while still enjoying it immensely. By midday, the day had settled into a rhythm shaped by appointments and appearances. Every activity served a purpose, reinforcing reputation, maintaining elegance, demonstrating taste. Nothing was random, even when it felt leisurely. Victorian wealth was a full-time performance, and mornings were merely the opening act. As noon approached, the wealthy returned home for luncheon, already prepared and waiting. More tea, more porcelain, more silver that gleamed with almost uncomfortable insistence. In the dining room, sunlight filtered through flawless windows that servants polished daily. The air smelled faintly of bread, roses, and whatever perfume the wealthy had dabbed on earlier. Everything felt soft, predictable, and perfectly arranged. And yet, beneath all this comfort, there was an undercurrent, a quiet awareness that wealth came with expectations, pressure, and constant observation. The wealthy had to maintain reputation, uphold family standards, and navigate the endless labyrinth of social rules. Even in the softness of mourning, there was a weight to it all, disguised beneath layers of silk and civility. But that pressure would unfold later, for now the mourning had established the stage, a life cushioned by luxury, orchestrated by unseen hands, and carried forward by tradition. A world where waking up wasn't a simple act, but a ceremony, where comfort wasn't accidental, but curated, where the wealthy moved through life guided by rituals so ingrained they barely noticed them. It was only the beginning of the day, but already the machinery of Victorian wealth had clicked into motion. And as the mansion hummed with quiet efficiency, the next part of the journey waited just beyond noon. The afternoon hours in the life of a wealthy Victorian Londoner were a strange blend of leisure, responsibility, and theater. After all, staying rich wasn't just about having money, it was about sustaining the illusion that one was effortlessly born for this life. This illusion required time, poise, and a surprising amount of quiet panic that was never shown, only managed internally during carriage rides, luncheons, and precisely timed interactions. By the time luncheon ended, with the last crumb removed from the table before it even had a chance to settle, the wealthy were expected to enter the next phase of the day, the business of being rich.
Despite what the newspapers liked to say, most wealthy Victorians did not actually work, at least not in the sense that involved sweat, tools, or solving immediate problems. Their world was built on paper, not labor. Shares, investments, land rents, and inherited estates kept the money flowing, while the owners maintained the careful appearance of being busy.
The rich had mastered the art of purposeful inactivity, looking serious while doing absolutely nothing that could crease a cuff. So after luncheon, the wealthy usually retreated to a study, private sitting room or library, a space lined with books that were more decorative than well-read. The purpose of this room was simple: to look intelligent, industrious, and slightly too occupied to be bothered, even if the most demanding task of the hour was choosing between reading a letter or staring thoughtfully at a window. Papers were arranged on the desk in a manner that suggested importance. A glass of refined sherry or tea sat nearby, and the wealthy would settle into a chair with the kind of dignified posture that said, "I am contemplating significant matters," even when the only significant matter was whether the afternoon would include a nap. Correspondence was the first order of business. Letters had arrived earlier in the morning, most written in elegant loops of ink that made every message look like poetry, even when it was just gossip disguised as concern. Invitations to dinners and soirees were read with cautious interest. Declining had to be done politely. Accepting had to be done strategically. The wealthy could not simply show up anywhere they pleased. They had to calculate who else might be there, what dresses would be worn, what political alliances were drifting through the city like invisible smoke, and which acquaintances were currently entangled in scandals best avoided. Financial matters, though handled by stewards and solicitors, still required a token glance. Sometimes the wealthy skimmed through reports that explained how estates were being managed, how tenants were paying rent, and how investments abroad were performing. The language of finance was its own kind of quiet fog, dense, opaque, and easy to pretend to understand. If profits were high, the wealthy nodded knowingly. If profits were low, they frowned delicately, as though the sheer force of their disappointment could influence the economy. Either way, they rarely had to lift a finger. Other people did the worrying for them. Still, this veneer of responsibility served an important purpose. Victorian society valued dignity, poise, and contribution, at least in appearance. A rich man lounging all day without at least pretending to work risked being labeled idle. A wealthy woman without a list of afternoon duties risked being called frivolous. So the wealthy maintained an air of solemn engagement because appearances were the scaffolding of their social existence. By mid-afternoon, it became necessary to leave the study and engage with the outside world. Visits had to be paid, acquaintances had to be acknowledged, social presence had to be maintained like a fragile plant that required constant watering. A carriage would be called for yet again, and the wealthy stepped into it with a mild expression of resigned nobility, as though even leisure required courage. The streets of London offered a different perspective at this hour. The fog had thinned, replaced by a clearer, busier city humming with activity. Vendors called out prices, children raced along alleyways, workers moved in hurried clusters, performing the unseen labor that kept the entire city from collapsing. The wealthy watched it all from behind polished glass, observing life without ever brushing up against it. The carriage rolled smoothly over cobblestones that had been ruthlessly swept and maintained in the affluent districts. Not all streets were equal. Some were meant for walking, some for working, and others, like the one the wealthy traveled now, were meant for being seen. Social calls were a critical part of the afternoon. They were short, polite, and deeply strategic. A visit to a friend's home meant being ushered into a drawing room filled with floral upholstery, porcelain vases, and family portraits that seemed to follow you with judgmental eyes. Small talk floated around the room like feathers, soft, harmless, and occasionally irritating. Conversation rarely touched on anything substantial. Instead, it revolved around weather, fashion, recent engagements, artistic opinions, or theories about who might be secretly miserable. Polite society thrived on refined speculation. The visits never lasted long. Staying too briefly was rude. Staying too long was desperate. A perfect balance had to be maintained, and the wealthy had calibrated timing with the precision of astronomers charting planetary orbits. After a suitable number of minutes had passed, they stood, exchanged polite nods, and retreated back to the carriage, leaving behind a faint scent of perfume and unspoken judgments. Next came a stroll through the park, another essential performance. The wealthy did not walk in parks for exercise. Exercise was for people whose lives involved effort. No, walking in parks was for displaying one's wardrobe, demonstrating one's posture, and casually encountering peers who conveniently happened to be strolling by at the exact same time. It was a carefully choreographed dance disguised as relaxation. Parasols twirled, canes tapped, gloves were adjusted. The wealthy glided along gravel paths as though floating across a gallery floor. The conversations here were more open, more lively, and occasionally more pointed. Someone always had a story about a cousin's misbehavior, or a rumor whispered by a footman, or an opinion about a new novel that everyone claims to have read but secretly skimmed. There were debates. For example, whether the weather favored a country holiday soon, or whether the latest charity event would be excessively indulgent or merely moderately indulgent. Every comment mattered, even when it didn't. Social standing was shaped in moments like these, with phrases delivered lightly but loaded with potential implications. After the promenade, it was customary to stop at a club or salon. For wealthy men, clubs were sanctuaries of leather chairs, cigar smoke, and murmured conversations about investments and politics. These conversations often sounded profound, but rarely changed anything. For wealthy women, salons or tea rooms offered spaces for elegant chatter, fashion comparisons, and discussions about art or music that flowed as gently as the tea poured into delicate cups. Each environment reinforced the unspoken rules of class: speak softly, appear confident, and never reveal uncertainty. The business of being rich continued in these spaces. Connections were strengthened, alliances formed, rivalries simmered beneath smiles. Decisions about upcoming events were solidified, and all of it happened under the guise of harmless socializing. There was an art to being present but never intrusive, polite but never passive, charming but never obvious. The wealthy learned this art from childhood, absorbing social cues as easily as breathing. By late afternoon, the day settled into a comfortable lull. The wealthy returned home, escorted once more by the patient clatter of carriage wheels. The mansion awaited them like a loyal old creature, warm, polished, and predictably magnificent. Servants greeted them with perfect posture, offering slippers, refreshments, or freshly lit lamps. The wealthy moved through rooms illuminated by the golden glow of gaslight, admiring their own home as though seeing it for the first time, even though nothing had changed since morning, except the shadows. This hour offered a rare moment of semi-privacy. The wealthy might retreat to a sitting room, a conservatory, or a personal nook lined with cushions. Here they could exhale, loosen their posture, and let a hint of the day's effort show. Even wealth, with all its cushions and conveniences, carried its quiet fatigue. There was an emotional heaviness to perpetual performance, one that slipped through the cracks when no one was watching. They might browse a book, though reading was often symbolic rather than immersive. They might write in a journal, sketch a flower arrangement, or simply stare into the middle distance with the expression of someone pondering deep philosophical questions while actually thinking, "I wonder if the new waistcoat was worth the price." A footman might bring tea, a maid might adjust curtains, a runner might deliver news of an unexpected guest or a newly arrived invitation. And through all this, the wealthy maintained their careful composure, knowing that soon they would transition into the evening rituals, which carried their own version of responsibility. But that belonged to another chapter. For now, the business of being rich had been conducted with its familiar blend of ease and complexity. The afternoon had been filled with duties that weren't truly duties, conversations that glided like ribbons, and small performances that shaped their identity more than they ever admitted. Wealth was comfort, but it was also choreography. It demanded grace in the smallest gestures, strategy in the simplest outings, and patience in the longest afternoons. It was a life lived behind invisible velvet ropes, cushioned from hardship, but encased in expectations. And as the sunlight softened into a deeper gold across the mansion walls, the wealthy prepared to enter the next act of their day, one filled with dinners, appearances, and even more of society's polished theater. Evening crept into Victorian London in a way that felt almost intentional, as though the sky itself understood how important it was to set the mood for the wealthy. The light dimmed slowly, politely, offering just enough time for the gas lamps to sputter awake, and the servants to move through the house, illuminating room after room with that warm amber glow that made everything look just a bit softer and far more expensive. Shadows stretched across the carved woodwork, dancing gently along the walls, giving the mansion a quiet theatricality. It was as if the building knew that night was when true elegance awakened. Even before the first star appeared, servants began preparing for the evening rituals with their usual silent coordination. Fires were stoked, fresh linens laid out, and clothing ironed to an inch of its life. The evening wardrobe was the crown jewel of the day, and for the very wealthy, it was not just an outfit, it was a declaration. After all, you couldn't simply arrive at a dinner or ball looking like someone who had been sitting comfortably doing nothing all day. You needed to look like someone who had spent the entire afternoon consulting the muses of style or receiving divine guidance through embroidery.
As the wealthy returned to their private chambers, they felt the house shift subtly around them. It was quieter now, more deliberate. Even their footsteps seemed to echo slightly less, softened by the thick carpets that stretched from room to room. Everything slowed, the pace, the sound, the light. Everything understood its role in easing the wealthy from the businesslike calm of afternoon into the velvet serenity of evening. The dressing process for the evening was far more elaborate than the morning. The layers were more luxurious, the fabrics heavier, and the stakes significantly higher. Servants worked with the concentration of watchmakers, fastening buttons, adjusting hems, and smoothing every wrinkle that dared to exist. Clothing was a form of currency in Victorian society. It spoke before you did, announced your intentions, and ranked you, quietly but clearly, among your peers. Even a single mistake, a ribbon not perfectly aligned, a coat slightly out of season, could spark whispers so persistent they would still be echoing weeks later. While dressing, conversations with attendants were kept light but respectful. Servants offered small observations about the evening's weather or the likelihood of certain guests appearing at tonight's social gathering. The wealthy responded with mild interest, careful not to reveal any emotional investment. Caring too deeply about a dinner party was considered gauche. Caring just enough to appear informed was ideal. Once fully dressed, the wealthy drifted into the drawing room for a moment of poised calm before departure. The drawing room served as a kind of emotional airlock between the privacy of home and the performance of society. Here, the wealthy adjusted gloves, checked pocket watches, or lifted perfume bottles with calculated nonchalance. The faint scent of roses mingled with sandalwood as they prepared to transform themselves into social beings, creatures who could glide through conversations, smile without meaning it, and engage in polite diplomacy with the ease of seasoned diplomats. Soon enough, the carriage waited outside, horses shifting their weight impatiently as the footman stood ready to assist.
Stepping into a carriage at night was its own small ritual. The lamps outside flickered against the polished surface, illuminating silhouettes and producing a quiet sense of anticipation. The wealthy settled into the plush interior, feeling the soft upholstery beneath them and hearing the gentle clatter of hooves as they pulled away from the mansion. Evening in London held a beauty that daytime rarely achieved. The city softened under the glow of gas lamps, their halos of light blurring slightly in the thin fog that curled along the streets. Buildings appeared taller, more dramatic. Pavements glistened faintly, even when it hadn't rained, as though the city itself had been polished for the night. Shops closed their shutters, while taverns sparked with laughter in distant corners. And through all this movement, the wealthy rode cocooned in their carriage, untouched by the city's rougher edges. Tonight, they were headed to a dinner party, a cornerstone of Victorian evening life. Dinner parties were not simply about eating, they were about presence, alliances, reputation, and quietly showing off how well one managed both wealth and refinement. Arriving too early suggested eagerness. Arriving too late suggested arrogance. Arriving exactly on time suggested breeding. And so the carriage rolled toward the venue with impeccable timing. The host's mansion glowed warmly as the carriage approached, its windows bright and inviting. Other carriages lined the street, each arriving with the same calculated precision. The wealthy stepped down, guided by the footman's steady hand, and entered the grand foyer where warmth, conversation, and gentle clinking of glasses rose like a welcoming breeze. The social atmosphere of a Victorian dinner was a delicate ecosystem. Conversations floated from group to group like migrating birds, never resting too long in one place. Guests discussed literature they pretended to adore, adventures they hadn't experienced firsthand, and observations about society delivered with the kind of light sarcasm that could only be uttered by people who believed themselves immune to misfortune. The wealthy navigated this world with practiced ease. Names were exchanged, hands were shaken, and compliments were delivered with precision, subtle enough to avoid suspicion, but meaningful enough to count. Every word mattered, every gesture was observed, even the way one held a glass was silently judged. Dinner itself was a multi-course performance. Courses flowed one after another, each accompanied by murmurs of approval from guests who had dined so well for so long that genuine excitement would have been considered undignified. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath chandeliers that dripped with light. Silverware glimmered in perfect alignment. Servants moved like synchronized shadows, clearing plates without interrupting conversation. At the table, the wealthy maintained impeccable posture, even when their backs ached from hours of rigid elegance. They laughed softly at the appropriate moments, raised eyebrows in polite sympathy, and exchanged brief glances with acquaintances across the table. Every interaction was coded, layered, and intentional. A raised eyebrow could be a question, a subtle smile could be a victory, a lingering glance could ignite an entire season of speculation. As the evening progressed, the conversation deepened into territories that Victorian society considered both meaningful and safe. Politics, but only the kind that didn't upset anyone. Art, but only the pieces everyone agreed were brilliant. Science, but only the discoveries that didn't undermine tradition. Philosophy, but only the parts that made people sound thoughtful without actual introspection. It was conversation as craft, not confession.
After dinner, the guests migrated to the parlor or ballroom for post-meal entertainment. Music filled the air, sometimes a pianist, sometimes a singer, occasionally a string quartet hired specifically for the occasion. The wealthy listened with serene expressions, hands folded or gently clasped, as though absorbing culture through pure willpower. Even those who didn't understand the music pretended to feel moved by it, because being unmoved was simply not an option in polite society.
Then came the late evening socializing, the quieter moments near the fireplace, the meaningful but not too meaningful exchanges, the discussions about upcoming balls or charitable events. These gatherings deepened connections, reinforced reputations, and allowed the wealthy to shape their position within the social hierarchy, which mattered far more than they ever admitted aloud. By the time the carriages were summoned, the night air felt cool against their skin. The wealthy stepped out of the mansion with slow, composed movements, maintaining elegance until the very last moment. Once inside the carriage again, they felt the day's weight settle across their shoulders. The conversations, the expectations, the quiet vigilance required to move through society without misstep, all of it lingered like a faint hum. The journey home was calm. Streets were quieter now, their lamps glowing gently in the night. The wealthy leaned back against the soft interior of the carriage, allowing themselves a moment of release. A sigh here, a loosened posture there. Nothing dramatic, just the quiet exhale of someone who had spent the entire evening being perfectly well behaved. When they arrived home, the mansion welcomed them with its warm lights and familiar stillness. Servants quickly but quietly assisted them, taking coats, extinguishing lamps, and ensuring everything was prepared for the later hours. The wealthy ascended the staircase at a slow, unhurried pace, tired but composed. Their private quarters were peaceful again. The fire glowed gently, cushioned chairs waited nearby, and fresh nightclothes lay neatly folded. The wealthy changed with the same careful assistance as earlier, though now the atmosphere felt softer, less ceremonial, more intimate. The day's burdens loosened with every ribbon untied, every layer removed. By the time they settled into bed, the world outside felt distant, softened by silence. They lay back against fresh linens, feeling the faint warmth of the fire on their face. Their mind drifted, not towards plans, not towards worries, but towards a gentle, foggy calm. A calm earned by an entire day of performing the role expected of them, even if the performance was cushioned, elegant, and wrapped in velvet. They closed their eyes as the last embers in the fireplace flickered quietly. Another day in the life of Victorian wealth had passed, carefully choreographed, richly adorned, and softly exhausting. And tomorrow, the performance would begin again. By the time late afternoon crept across the polished floors of a wealthy Victorian home, the entire household entered a peculiar state of suspended activity, a quiet hum of preparation, anticipation, and strategic invisibility. Because evening for the filthy rich wasn't just a time of day, it was a performance, a ritual, a delicate dance of silk, etiquette, gossip, and the constant, suffocating awareness that someone, somewhere, was always judging. A Victorian evening could unfold in many places, a dining room glittering with crystal, a private club veiled in cigar smoke, a shop lit by oil lamps for a bit of late-night extravagance, a theater box with velvet drapes and perfect acoustics, or some drawing room where everyone pretended to enjoy the company of everyone else. But no matter the location, the wealthy shared one truth: their nights were never truly their own. Our wealthy subject would begin the evening ritual long before leaving the house. Preparing to dine, socialize, or simply be seen required a kind of patience normally reserved for monks and clockmakers. Dressing, of course, wasn't a simple matter of putting clothes on. It was an hours-long ceremony of layers, fittings, adjustments, quiet panic, and the faint hope that the new outfit wouldn't betray last month's fashion decisions. Servants circulated like shadows, tightening corsets or adjusting vestcoats, brushing off invisible specks, polishing shoes that already glowed like black mirrors. The house seemed to hold its breath while the wealthy transformed themselves into polished versions of the people they had already been all day.
The only difference was the stakes. You could be slightly disheveled at breakfast, you could be mildly imperfect at lunch, but at dinner? Heaven forbid. Dinner was where your real reputation lived. As the final layer of scent, jewelry, or subtle charm was applied, the household entered its evening transition. Lamps were lit, fires were stoked, curtains were drawn closed with a sense of importance they absolutely didn't need. The air warmed, softened, and filled with the faint perfume of wax and coal. No matter where the evening led, this moment, the small pause before departure, felt like the quiet turning of a page. If the family remained at home, the dining room became the center of the universe. Dinner, especially among the rich, wasn't just a meal, it was a carefully orchestrated theater production in which the performers weren't allowed to look directly at the stage manager, because the stage manager was a butler, and butlers, when properly trained, moved like dignified ghosts. The table itself looked like it had been set by someone competing for an invisible prize. Every fork, spoon, plate, and napkin was positioned with mathematical precision. Candles were arranged so the light hit everyone's faces in the most flattering way possible. It was the Victorian version of good lighting, only powered by beeswax and the determination to look interesting.
Conversation at dinner moved in slow, looping currents. No one spoke too quickly, no one confessed anything meaningful, and no one dared to mention anything that might be categorized as work, conflict, or emotion. But they could and did talk for hours about travel plans, minor scandals, weather patterns, and the complicated day a cousin once had while buying a new hat. If guests were present, the stakes rose even higher. Every gesture became a performance. Every sentence carried hidden rules. Every moment had the faintest tension beneath it, like a polite social duel conducted with silk gloves and delicate smiles. One wrong comment could bloom into weeks of whispered analysis in drawing rooms across the city. Victorians didn't forget anything, especially the wrong things. Of course, not every evening was spent in the dining room. Many nights demanded grander stages. A ball, for instance, was a spectacle of noise and softness, glittering chandeliers, swirling skirts, polished floors, orchestras tucked into corners, and young people pretending they didn't care whether they would secure an advantageous marriage. Balls were where reputations were made, broken, or quietly negotiated behind lace fans and polite nods. The wealthy didn't attend to enjoy themselves, they attended to remain visible, relevant, and gracefully competitive. Then there were the theater nights. Filthy rich Victorians didn't sit among the general audience, they occupied their private boxes, elevated like little balconies of superiority. These boxes weren't just about seeing the performance, they were about being seen seeing the performance. People would peer across the theater with opera glasses designed to bring the rest of the audience just close enough to judge. If the gentlemen of the family chose to spend the evening at their private clubs instead, a different world unfolded. Clubs were places where wealthy men escaped polite conversation and replaced it with slightly less polite conversation. They sank into leather chairs, debated politics as if the fate of the planet depended on it, read newspapers with the heavy seriousness of men who enjoyed appearing serious, and enjoyed drinks poured by staff who understood that any sound louder than a soft exhale was unacceptable. Meanwhile, the ladies had their own evening rituals. After dinner, they might withdraw to a drawing room, arranged in a soft circle of lamplight and polished furniture. The room glowed with warmth and delicate color, as if someone had taken care to ensure nothing in it could possibly offend the eye. Conversations drifted gently from topic to topic, each one light enough to float, yet heavy enough to signal intelligence and refinement. Embroidery, letter writing, music performances, and storytelling filled the air, turning the space into a quiet, cultivated sanctuary. What made Victorian evenings so strange was the combination of strict structure and unspoken freedom. Everyone knew their role, their place, their responsibilities, but within those boundaries, the wealthy carved out small pockets of private life, secret frustrations, subtle jokes, fleeting glimmers of genuine feeling. They didn't always show it, but even among the rich, evenings held moments of surprising softness. A glance across a supper table, a private word exchanged in a hallway, a laugh shared at something slightly ridiculous. Wealth provided the stage, but humanity added the texture. As the evening wore on, the world outside faded into deepening fog. The city dimmed under gas lamps that flickered in the mist like half-awake fireflies. Carriages rattled softly past, distant footsteps echoed along narrow streets, and somewhere, far off, a lamplighter finished his rounds, unaware that dozens of wealthy households were spinning out their nightly traditions behind closed doors. Back inside, the evening gradually loosened its grip. Conversations slowed, postures relaxed. The wealthy reached the quiet threshold where social obligations gave way to personal rhythms. They still had to maintain decorum, of course, but the edges softened a little. People began to say things they actually meant, or at least closer to what they meant. Eventually, it was time to retreat back into the house, or back into private rooms if they never left. The flicker of candlelight guided weary feet through hallways lined with carpets so thick they muffled even the most determined footstep. Lamps were extinguished one by one, plunging corridors into warm, comforting darkness. The house exhaled as if relieved its residents had stopped performing themselves for the evening. For many wealthy Victorians, this was the closest they came to peace. A long day of expectations, rituals, and appearances gave way to a nighttime quiet that felt almost tender. Servants moved silently through the house, closing curtains, banking fires, and preparing bedrooms for their employer's return. Feather mattresses were fluffed, water was warmed, nightwear was laid out carefully in the exact spot where it needed to be so no one had to experience the horror of locating their own clothing. When the wealthy finally retired to their rooms, the transformation was almost magical. The grand social version of themselves faded away, replaced by something softer, simpler, almost human. Evening clothes were peeled off, jewelry unclasped, hair unpinned, and posture abandoned in favor of something much more comfortable and far less photogenic. This was the moment when exhaustion crept in, like a polite visitor who didn't want to interrupt the quiet.
Even their bedrooms were designed to cradle the night. Thick draperies trapped warmth and muffled sound. The fire glowed low, casting slow shadows that swayed against the walls like sleepy dancers. The mattress invited surrender, and for the first time all day, the wealthy could simply exist, not perform, not posture, not maintain appearances, just breathe and settle into the soft warmth of privacy. Of course, even this peace wasn't entirely unbroken. Wealth rarely allowed total freedom. There were diaries to update, because self-reflection was a respectable vice, letters to finish, because communication by post carried its own subtle power. A final cup of warm drink might be sipped slowly, letting the heat loosen whatever thoughts were still clinging to the day. And somewhere in that gentle quiet, the wealthy eased themselves towards sleep in the same careful way they did everything else. Outside, the city continued its restless whispering, but inside these grand homes, the noise softened into nothing. The night wrapped the wealthy in layers of heavy fabric and heavier expectations, and though their lives seemed effortless to anyone observing from a distance, the wealthy understood, perhaps better than anyone, that maintaining a perfect world required endless, invisible work. As they drifted into sleep, the house settled with them. Floors creaked softly, fires dimmed, clocks ticked behind closed doors, and the wealthy, wrapped in blankets and comfort, let go of the world for a few quiet hours. Tomorrow would bring new rituals, new expectations, new obligations. But for tonight, the fog outside could have the city. The dark belonged to them. Morning in a wealthy Victorian household didn't simply begin, it unfolded, slowly and precisely, like a carefully timed curtain rising on a play everyone in the house already knew by heart. While the city outside stirred in a mixture of clatter, coughs, and cartwheels grinding against the cobblestones, the wealthy woke to a much softer world,
one curated by people who never appeared in the story unless absolutely necessary. Before the first rays of daylight pushed through heavy curtains, the household staff was already awake. Fires were being rekindled, water heated, breakfast arranged, boots polished, and clothing aired. The wealthy, of course, slept through all of this domestic choreography, resting peacefully while others hurried through tasks designed to ensure they never had to experience the slightest discomfort. When our wealthy subject finally stirred, it wasn't the sunlight that greeted them, but a servant's gentle knock, or perhaps the soft clink of a tea tray being set onto a bedside table. Morning tea was ritual, and its arrival was almost as predictable as the city fog. The wealthy didn't truly wake up so much as glide into consciousness with the assistance of warm porcelain and a flavor that hinted at a world far beyond London's soot and cobblestone. The bed itself was a kind of luxurious island, not something you simply left without preparation. Layers upon layers of blankets, quilts, and counterpanes had kept the cold at bay through the night. The mattress, stuffed with feathers or horsehair, had conformed just enough to feel supportive but never disorderly. Everything about the wealthy person's sleep was designed to feel earned, even though it was mostly arranged by people they rarely addressed directly. After the tea, the true morning ritual began. A servant might enter to open the curtains, a process that felt almost ceremonial. The heavy fabric swept aside to reveal a pale London morning, the kind where the sky looked undecided, hovering somewhere between pearl gray and dull silver. Outside, distant carriages rattled down the streets, and the sound of boots echoed faintly through the fog, reminding the wealthy that life existed beyond their windows, though it rarely touched them directly. Dressing for the day was a complex operation, requiring both patience and a complete lack of urgency. For a wealthy Victorian, clothing wasn't just practical, it was a statement, a shield, a quiet announcement that they belonged to a certain class with certain expectations. Being rich meant never choosing an outfit alone. Servants assisted carefully, helping with layers, buttons, corsets, ties, stays, collars, and anything else that required extra hands or an extra pair of eyes. Every garment had a purpose. Morning wear was more relaxed, though still polished. Fabrics were soft, colors were calm, and nothing was worn without intention. Even casual clothing among the wealthy looked formal enough to attend a government meeting. By the time the dressing ritual ended, the wealthy individual felt fully assembled, armored in silk, cotton, and social expectations. Breakfast was its own small performance. It took place in a dining room that smelled faintly of warm bread, polished wood, and the lingering smoke from the morning fire. This meal was quieter than dinner, less ceremonial, but still laden with unspoken rules. Plates were filled with eggs, toast, fish, fruit, or pastries. Coffee steamed beside tea, both offered as if they were essential to the continuation of civilization. Newspapers sat on side tables, waiting to be read with the full seriousness of a person evaluating the fate of the empire. As family members gathered together, the conversation was light, very light. No one wanted to disturb the delicate morning peace with anything resembling urgency. Observations about the weather, minor updates about acquaintances, and upcoming social events floated through the room like polite, harmless ghosts. The atmosphere had a softness to it, as if everyone had agreed that mornings were not the time for strong opinions or emotional revelations. After breakfast, the house entered its daytime rhythm. Servants moved briskly but silently throughout the halls, cleaning rooms that were already tidy, dusting surfaces that appeared spotless, and maintaining a level of order that seemed impossible through ordinary human effort. The wealthy, meanwhile, began their version of productivity. For men, this often involved writing letters, reviewing documents, attending meetings, or discussing business, activities that required them to appear industrious without ever descending into the realm of actual physical labor. Being wealthy meant never lifting anything heavier than a pen unless you were making an extremely dramatic point. For women, the morning hours were dedicated to what society called accomplishments. These included tasks such as practicing the piano, organizing correspondence, managing the household staff, planning social visits, coordinating charitable efforts, or reading books meant to improve the mind without introducing disruptive ideas. It was a delicate balance. Intelligence was encouraged, but too much ambition was quietly frowned upon. There was a certain serenity to the wealthy morning, a calmness that stood in sharp contrast to the chaos of London's streets. Outside, chimney sweeps scrambled up rooftops, vendors shouted prices, carts rolled through the grime, factory whistles blared, and thousands of people rushed through their daily struggles. Inside the wealthy home, by comparison, time felt slower, gentler, almost padded. Wealth created a distance from the world, a protective layer that softened the edges of daily life. As the late morning sun finally pushed through the haze and reached higher into the sky, the wealthy prepared for whatever small adventures the day required. A carriage ride, perhaps, to visit a friend or inspect a shop window. A consultation with a tailor or dressmaker. A stroll through a park where the pathways were wide enough to avoid mud and the benches clean enough to actually sit on. Wealth provided options that never felt rushed or necessary, only available. Even their leisure had structure. A wealthy Victorian could spend hours engaged in activities that looked simple but carried deep social importance. Reading wasn't merely reading, it was a sign of refinement. Writing letters wasn't just communication, it was a mark of one's social circle. Practicing music wasn't just practice, it was the cultivation of taste. Everything had meaning, even the smallest gestures, and nothing was done carelessly. In the background, the house continued its steady rhythm. Fires needed tending, lamps polishing, beds remaking, meals preparing. The wealthy didn't witness the effort, but they enjoyed the comfort it provided. Every polished surface, every warm room, every perfectly arranged floral display existed because someone else made it happen quietly, efficiently, and without thanks. Late morning drifted toward midday, and the household settled into a peaceful lull. The wealthy moved through rooms filled with soft light and expensive furniture, their footsteps muted by carpets thick enough to smother sound. Time seemed to lose its urgency. No one hurried, no one rushed to meet a deadline. The day unfolded at a pace that felt both indulgent and inevitable, like drifting down a slow-moving river. And yet, beneath the calm surface, there was always an awareness of the invisible machinery that made this lifestyle possible. Servants stood waiting in doorways, ready to assist with the smallest need. Cooks labored in hot kitchens, gardeners tended the grounds, coachmen prepared carriages. Everyone had a role, and those roles kept the wealthy world smooth and predictable. As noon approached, the wealthy prepared for the next small ritual, a midday refresh, a soft turning point in the day. The morning had passed gently, wrapped in comfort and routine, and though nothing dramatic had happened, the wealthy would have considered it productive in its own quiet way. After all, maintaining one's position in society required consistency, stability, the careful performance of ease. Because for the wealthy Victorian, every moment of the day, no matter how peaceful, was part of a larger, ongoing display. A soft, polished, perfectly timed narrative meant to convey refinement, status, and absolute control over life's smallest details. But in the quiet of the morning, before the demands of afternoon and evening rushed in, they allowed themselves a little softness, a little warmth, a little space to breathe in the gentle luxury of their world. And as the clock chimed and midday light filled the house, the day prepared to shift again. Afternoon for the wealthy in Victorian London was a strange, gentle kind of limbo. Not quite leisurely, not quite industrious, and certainly not chaotic. It was a time suspended between expectations, a long stretch where the day seemed to take a slow breath and simply drift. For many rich Victorians, afternoon was when they truly settled into themselves. Morning had its rituals, evening had its performances, but afternoon? Afternoon was where they wandered through the soft middle chapters of their day without needing to impress anyone too aggressively. The afternoon often treated the early afternoon as a time to step outside the confines of their homes without venturing too far into anything that resembled real life. If they decided to go out, they did it elegantly. A carriage ride through a quiet park offered the illusion of freedom without exposing anyone to mud, noise, or the unpredictable behavior of people who weren't rich. The parks themselves were manicured demonstrations of nature edited for comfort. Wider paths, softer landscapes, carefully chosen plantings, and benches that invited only the genteel to linger. A woman might glide through the park with a parasol shading her face, her presence floating like something slightly unreal. A man might stroll with his cane tapping lightly on the path, pretending he wasn't watching everyone else, while absolutely watching everyone else. Afternoon walks were part exercise, part performance, and part opportunity to be seen by the right people in the right place, looking appropriately calm and mildly interested in one's surroundings.
Shopping was another acceptable afternoon activity, though shopping in this context meant browsing through boutiques where every item had been pre-selected to appeal to someone who never needed to check a price. The wealthy didn't hurry through shops. They drifted. They examined objects not because they needed them, but because examining them signaled taste. A silk ribbon might be considered and rejected after long contemplation. A new glove design might be admired for an entire 10 minutes before anyone made a decision. Shopkeepers, trained in the delicate art of flattering the wealthy without appearing desperate, hovered silently until needed and vanished just as silently afterwards. For men, afternoon might include a visit to a club, though daytime hours were quieter there than the evening ones. Gentlemen sprawled in deep chairs like well-dressed cats basking in afternoon sun filtered through heavy drapes. They read newspapers with impressive seriousness, even if the headlines were about topics they already heard discussed at breakfast. They played slow games of cards, holding their hands with a confidence that suggested they were born knowing the rules. They wrote letters, debated policies, or contemplated philosophical dilemmas with an intensity usually reserved for deciding what color shoes to wear. At home, for those who didn't venture out, afternoon had its own rhythm. The wealthy's houses were never still. They breathed, they hummed, they flexed with quiet movement. Servants slipped silently from room to room, adjusting, tidying, preparing, maintaining the illusion that the house existed in a perpetual state of flawless order. You could walk through the halls and never catch a servant in the act of cleaning, yet the carpets remained immaculate, the fireplaces warm, the curtains symmetrical, the surfaces glossy. Wealth didn't eliminate work, it simply ensured the work happened just out of sight. When wealthy women remained home in the afternoon, they filled the hours with what society deemed accomplishment-friendly activities. This could include practicing piano pieces that was soft enough not to disturb the afternoon calm. Embroidery was a staple, hours spent stitching delicate flowers, patterns, or monograms into fine fabric. Painting was another possibility, though wealthy amateur artists tended to paint safe, courteous subjects, landscapes, seasonal scenes, still lifes, or occasionally a portrait of a house pet with an expression far too serious for its own good. Some afternoons were dedicated to writing letters. Correspondence was more than communication. It was a form of social maintenance, like polishing the silver of one's relationships. A letter might update a relative on recent events, or respond politely to an invitation, or gently decline something that sounded exhausting. Writing was slow, deliberate, and often performed with the same concentration one used for strategic diplomacy.
The wealthy were constantly tending to the invisible webs that connected them to others. Letters were their threads. There were also visits to make, calling on friends, acquaintances, or relatives during the designated visiting hours. Calling was a highly ritualized social exchange, complete with calling cards, specific times, and unspoken rules. A wealthy woman might spend an entire afternoon stepping in and out of carriages, gliding into sitting rooms, exchanging carefully calibrated conversation, politely admiring someone's decor, and sipping tea without actually tasting it. These visits weren't meant to be deeply personal. They existed to maintain social equilibrium. Everyone participated because everyone else did. Afternoon tea, however, was the true anchor of the wealthy afternoon. It didn't always happen at the same time, but when it came, it brought a sense of comfort strong enough to soften even the most rigid spine. Tea wasn't simply a beverage, it was an experience built from warmth, quiet, and the gentle sweetness of pastries that existed solely to bring a moment of softness to the day. Tea trays appeared with practiced elegance. Steam curled from porcelain. The clink of spoon against cup joined the calm soundtrack of the afternoon. Tea often turned into conversation, a different kind from the measured morning exchanges or the strategic evening ones. Afternoon talk was relaxed, a touch more honest, and occasionally even playful. The wealthy didn't let their guard down completely, but they allowed it to loosen just a little. Someone might share a bit of gossip that was harmless enough not to destroy reputations, but entertaining enough to fill the space between sips. Someone else might comment on a frustrating tailor or an upcoming event with mild dread disguised as diplomacy. Afternoon was also the time for reading, and reading among the wealthy wasn't idle. It showed cultivation. It showed intellect, but gently. Novels, newspapers, essays, and travel diaries were all acceptable reading materials, though novels were often enjoyed privately to avoid looking overly passionate about fictional events. The wealthy liked to give the impression that stories moved them just enough to be refined, but not enough to appear emotionally disturbed. Children in wealthy families had their own afternoon routines, though their schedules were managed so thoroughly by governesses, tutors, and nannies that parents might go entire days without seeing them. Afternoon lessons, quiet play, walks in the garden, and carefully supervised reading filled the hours of the younger members of the household. Childhood, like everything else in a wealthy Victorian home, was structured and polished, designed to produce future adults capable of blending seamlessly into society's expectations.
As the afternoon deepened toward evening, the atmosphere of the house shifted once again. Light filtered through windows at softer angles, colors warmed, shadows stretched across the floors in thoughtful patterns. Even the clocks seemed to tick differently, their rhythm aligning with the natural slowing of the day. Servants began preparing the evening stage, adjusting lamps, setting tables, warming water, and ensuring the house transitioned smoothly into its next phase. The wealthy moved through these late afternoon hours with unhurried purpose. There might be a bit more letter writing, one last walk through the garden if the weather permitted, or a comfortable moment spent by a window watching the city. The fog might begin to gather again, curling around rooftops and softening the edges of the world. Gas lamps flickered to life outside, bathing the streets in a glow that was somehow both eerie and comforting. What made afternoon in the wealthy Victorian world so fascinating and so quietly strange was how intentionally slow it was. Time expanded in ways that felt almost luxurious, as if each hour contained more softness than the one before it. The wealthy had mastered the art of turning nothing into something, of filling time with gentle activities that made them appear serene, cultured, and content. Yet beneath that calm, there lingered a subtle awareness that evening was approaching. Evening always carried weight. Evening demanded presence. Evening expected performance. And so, as the afternoon settled into its final moments, the wealthy allowed themselves a last stretch of quiet before stepping back into the world of expectation. The day wasn't over, but the softest part of it was ending.
Afternoon drifted into memory, lingering in the faint scent of tea, the warmth of filtered sunlight, and the gentle hum of a household preparing for its next chapter. And the wealthy Victorian, wrapped in the comfort of their world, moved effortlessly into the pause between afternoon and evening, ready to begin again.
Maids were the silent workforce that held everything together, sweeping, polishing, dusting, laundering, folding, emptying chamber pots, and generally erasing any evidence that human beings actually lived in the house. Their work was invisible by design. If a guest noticed a maid, it meant she wasn't doing her job. They moved through the home like ghosts, appearing only when needed and disappearing before anyone had the chance to remember their names. In the upstairs world, the rich drifted through their days in silk robes, unaware of the quiet choreography beneath their feet. But if you followed the echo of distant footsteps down a staircase that guests were never meant to see, you'd find the true engine of the home, the servants' quarters. Narrow hallways, modest rooms, shared spaces, and an air of perpetual motion. Bells lined the walls, actual bells, all labeled to a specific room upstairs, constantly chiming with the impatience of someone who couldn't possibly go 20 minutes without needing something. The bell system was the Victorian equivalent of a phone notification, except you weren't allowed to ignore it. A bell rang, a servant came. It didn't matter if they were eating, sleeping, scouring a pan, or just briefly enjoying the radical luxury of sitting down. Wealthy households rang dozens of times a day, often for very small things. A shawl moved 2 inches to the left, a window opened slightly more, a newspaper fetched from a table the employer could reach but didn't feel like reaching. The smallest inconvenience became a crisis requiring immediate intervention. To the wealthy, this wasn't indulgent, it was simply how things worked. Why have immense wealth if it didn't protect you from life's minor hassles? Why get cold fingers opening a window when someone else could get cold fingers for you? Why burden yourself with the catastrophic effort of taking a letter to the mailbox when a footman existed specifically to carry it? The logic was sound, or at least sound enough for Victorian high society. Of course, the servant system had its own social rules, its own tension, its own whispered dramas. The staff observed everything. They knew which family members were secretly feuding, which guests overstayed their welcome, which heir had developed a dramatic flair for sulking, which lady of the house had the habit of misplacing jewelry only to find it exactly where she left it, and which uncle should never be left alone with the sherry decanter. Servants became living diaries, recording the private lives of their employers without ever speaking a word. Discretion wasn't just expected, it was survival. Being rich in Victorian London also meant that staff weren't merely employees, they were status symbols. The number of servants you had was a direct reflection of your standing. 10 meant you were respectable, 20 meant you were impressive. More than that, and people started assuming you must have inherited something truly remarkable, an estate, a business empire, or an obscenely lucrative secret involving mines, railways, or scandalous family connections to money that just appeared one generation. Guests evaluated not only the household staff, but also their performance. A good butler elevated a family's social standing by sheer force of quiet competence. A dinner party was judged not on conversation, but on how flawlessly dishes were served, whether the wine decanter arrived before anyone needed to ask, and whether the footmen synchronized their movements well enough to make the whole evening feel like a slow-motion waltz. Servants also provided one of the greatest luxuries of all, consistency. No matter what chaos simmered beyond the front door, pollution, crowds, distant factory whistles, carriages clattering along the cobblestones, life inside the wealthy home remained a cocoon of calm predictability. Fires stayed lit, beds remained warm, meals arrived like clockwork, clothing magically cleaned itself through the exhausting labor of someone else naturally. Even emotional discomfort was managed in subtle ways.
If the lord of the house returned in a foul mood, someone discreetly ensured no unpleasant noises disturbed him. If the lady struggled with melancholy, the staff adjusted lighting, brought tea at strategic intervals, and shifted the household atmosphere so she might never realize human beings were deliberately smoothing her troubles. And yet, for all the elegance, the hierarchy was fragile. A single mistake could ripple through the house. A dropped plate might trigger a chain reaction of soft gasps and subtle glances. A poorly timed entrance could cause social embarrassment, a horror beyond imagination. Expectations were relentless, standards were high, and the wealthy, cushioned by their comfort, often forgot how much strain rested on the people who kept it all running. But to them, the system was invisible, just part of the natural architecture of wealth, as ordinary as breathing. In truth, the servant system was the greatest perk of being extraordinarily rich in Victorian London. It allowed the wealthy to exist in a state of near-permanent ease, drifting through their daily routines without ever directly touching the machinery of their own comfort. Life became smoother, quieter, softer, as though the sharp edges of the world had been sanded down by the constant labor of invisible hands.
And so, in these grand homes where fireplaces glowed, carpets muted every footstep, and meals appeared with effortless grace, being filthy rich didn't just mean having money. It meant living inside a carefully constructed illusion, a world where everything worked flawlessly, where every detail was managed, where life never intruded with anything inconvenient. It was luxury not just in material wealth, but in the complete absence of difficulty. Tonight, as we drift gently through this chapter, imagine the soft clink of silver being polished downstairs, the muffled thump of logs added to the fire, the quiet rustle of servants preparing the house for another day of flawless comfort. Because for the wealthy of Victorian London, this wasn't extravagance. This was simply how the world was supposed to work, smoothly, silently, beautifully, as if by magic, even though we both know who was really doing the magic.
And so, in these grand homes where fireplaces glowed, carpets muted every footstep, and meals appeared with effortless grace, being filthy rich didn't just mean having money. It meant living inside a carefully constructed illusion, a world where everything worked flawlessly, where every detail was managed, where life never intruded with anything inconvenient. It was luxury not just in material wealth, but in the complete absence of difficulty. Tonight, as we drift gently through this chapter, imagine the soft clink of silver being polished downstairs, the muffled thump of logs added to the fire, the quiet rustle of servants preparing the house for another day of flawless comfort. Because for the wealthy of Victorian London, this wasn't extravagance, this was simply how the world was supposed to work, smoothly, silently, beautifully, as if by magic. Even though we both know who was really doing the magic. If there was one thing the wealthy of Victorian London excelled at, besides avoiding physical exertion and cultivating an impressive collection of decorative objects with no clear function, it was throwing social events. Parties, dinners, soirees, musicales, readings, balls, teas, luncheons, and the vaguely defined at-home gatherings where people sat stiffly and pretended to enjoy themselves. The elite loved these events. They needed them the way plants need sunlight. Without constant social exposure, their reputations wilted. Being filthy rich wasn't just about owning expensive things. It was about making sure everyone else noticed you owned them. And what better way to display your wealth than by inviting dozens of people into your home and subtly ensuring they saw every glittering surface, every imported vase, every painting you pretended to understand, and every chandelier positioned at a height just low enough to force guests to admire it. Victorian social life operated like a delicate ecosystem. You didn't attend events simply for pleasure. You attended because it was expected, strategic, and sometimes necessary for survival. Invitations were currency.
Who you invited and who invited you said more about your status than your actual bank account. People climbed social ladders through carefully curated evenings of polite conversation, gloved handshakes, and the occasional microwaved compliment disguised as charm. Preparations for these events began hours, sometimes days, in advance. The entire household shifted gears like a grand theater troupe preparing for opening night. Servants polished surfaces until reflections looked unnervingly crisp. Cooks fussed over menus, balancing elegance with the unspoken requirement that the food must impress without suggesting effort. Footmen rehearsed the sequence of opening doors, presenting trays, and moving in synchronized, graceful lines. The floral arrangements alone could take hours, especially since Victorian wealthy had a habit of displaying flowers so extravagant they looked like botanical riots. Meanwhile, the hosts planned the evening with all the seriousness of military strategists. Seating arrangements were charts of social alliances and rivalries. You couldn't put Mrs. Fairfax next to Colonel Harrington unless you wanted a 3-hour debate over naval funding erupting over the soup. You couldn't place Miss Langley near the window because she was convinced drafts were out to personally assassinate her. And you absolutely couldn't seat anyone even vaguely interesting next to someone of lower rank, unless you wanted a scandal so delicious it would dominate breakfast table gossip for a week. And so the evening began. The wealthy drifted into drawing rooms like costumed actors entering stage left. Silk rustled, jewels caught the glow of lamplight, gloves fit tightly enough to make handshakes feel like delicate negotiations. The room smelled faintly of perfume, polished wood, and the unmistakable aroma of people desperately pretending they were enjoying themselves. Conversations followed predictable patterns. A gentleman might comment on the weather with such conviction you'd think he had personally invented it. A lady might respond with polite enthusiasm, as though discussing humidity were the highlight of her week. Everyone admired the decor, even if they had seen it countless times. Compliments rained down like confetti at a parade, except none of them were quite genuine. You had to praise the room, the refreshments, the lighting, the music, and occasionally the host's taste in curtains, even if those curtains looked like they'd been plucked from a Victorian fever dream. Music often floated in the background, usually provided by someone hired specifically to look elegant while playing something appropriately gentle. The goal was to create ambiance without encouraging enthusiasm. Victorian society feared enthusiasm. It was suspicious, unpredictable, and terribly unrefined. For the ultra-wealthy, entertainment went beyond a string quartet. They might host private readings by authors hoping for patronage. They might showcase paintings acquired from abroad, complete with long, confusing explanations. They might arrange for a singer to deliver an aria designed to make the audience quietly weepy. Audience members were expected to react with solemn admiration, even if they didn't entirely understand what they were admiring. Conversation deepened only slightly over time. People shared stories of vacations they barely remembered, investments they didn't personally manage, and acquaintances they didn't particularly like. The wealthy adored subtle upmanship, that gentle, razor-thin art of announcing your superiority without ever appearing crass. One lady might casually mention her family's summers in the country, only for another to accidentally recall that her family spent their summers on the continent. The entire exchange was the social equivalent of two peacocks fanning their feathers while pretending they weren't competing.
But the real drama occurred beneath the surface. Every glance meant something. Every compliment had a shadow behind it. Every pause was loaded with speculation. Wealthy Victorian society was a delicate ballet of public grace and private judgment. Someone arriving late triggered quiet murmurs about their priorities. Someone arriving unfashionably early signaled either desperation or inexperience. Someone leaving too soon suggested insult. Someone leaving too late suggested nosiness. This was the social world the rich inhabited, beautiful, glittering, exhausting.
Food played a central role in these gatherings. Multiple courses, delivered with perfection, designed to be visually impressive even if the portion sizes left guests wondering whether they should stop at the bakery on their way home. The wealthy didn't eat for hunger, they ate for aesthetics. Every dish had meaning. Every flavor carried significance, and, if nothing else, food provided a temporary distraction from the ongoing challenge of maintaining polite conversation with people you barely tolerated. As the evening drifted on, the atmosphere softened. People relaxed slightly, the way someone might relax when sitting on a very elegant and very stiff sofa. Some drifted toward the piano, others to card tables, others to the sideboard offering drinks that were just strong enough to make small talk slightly easier. Soft laughter rippled here and there, usually at a joke that wasn't especially amusing but carried the weight of social obligation. And all the while, servants moved quietly through the scene, refilling glasses, clearing plates, adjusting lighting, and performing 1,000 invisible tasks. They knew how to walk without being seen, how to listen without appearing present, how to anticipate needs before the wealthy even realized they had them. And though the guests barely acknowledged them, they were the only people in the house who truly understood how these gatherings functioned. Eventually, the evening dimmed. Guests retrieved cloaks and coats, complimented the host again, promised to arrange future visits they secretly hoped to avoid, and stepped out into the cool night air. Their departure triggered a transformation. With the front door closed, the home exhaled. Servants began their long process of cleaning, clearing, straightening, extinguishing candles, and restoring the house to perfect order. The hosts, tired from an evening of smiling politely, finally loosened the stiffness in their shoulders and allowed themselves to breathe normally. Being wealthy in Victorian London meant living in a constant cycle of social performance. Every event was a stage, every guest an audience, every gesture a line in an ongoing script. These gatherings weren't just entertainment, they were declarations of status, demonstrations of refinement, and quiet campaigns for influence. The wealthy used them to strengthen alliances, form connections, negotiate unspoken arrangements, and keep their names in circulation like prized collectibles. And yet, there was a certain comfort to it all. These nights offered a glow, not just from candlelight or polished crystal, but from the predictable rhythm of high society. The warmth of conversation, however superficial, mingled with soft music and the steady hum of activity. It created an atmosphere that felt safe, familiar, and insulated from the harsher realities outside. Tonight, as we drift together through this chapter, imagine the soft rustle of silk gowns, the clink of crystal glasses, the muted laughter echoing through grand hallways. Picture the flickering lamplight glancing off marble columns and the gentle sweep of footmen moving through the crowd like silent shadows. This was the world of the Victorian elite, a world built on elegance, expectation, subtle competition, and carefully choreographed evenings that stretched long into the night. A world where glittering gatherings weren't just entertainment, but a way of life, a shimmering illusion the wealthy clung to like a comforting dream. As night deepened across Victorian London, the city outside wealthy homes became a mixture of fog, flickering gas lamps, and distant carriage wheels rattling over cobblestones. Inside, however, life moved at a different pace, one carefully moderated, orchestrated, and insulated from the unpredictability of the streets. Wealthy Victorians had perfected the art of retreat. While the city outside struggled with noise, grime, and chaos, the elite retreated into a world designed to shelter, soothe, and impress, where every detail was managed by hands that were almost invisible to them. Evenings had their performances, as we've seen, but nights were about subtle transitions, a move from society to solitude, from entertainment to quiet reflection.
In the heart of a grand home, rooms that earlier hosted conversation, music, and the polite tedium of social gatherings now held a hushed serenity. Candles were dimmed, fires flickered low, casting dancing shadows across polished wood and rich tapestries. The house breathed slowly, each room settling for its version of calm. For the wealthy, nighttime offered a kind of private luxury rarely discussed, the ability to reflect on their day without interruption. Unlike most of the city's inhabitants who faced the demands of labor or survival around the clock, the rich had the freedom to linger in thought, to consider what had passed and what was to come, all within walls designed to buffer them from the harshness of reality. A sitting room might glow with the faint light of a single lamp, a faint breeze might drift in through a slightly cracked window, and for a moment the house existed as a separate world entirely, separate from the soot, fog, and chaos just beyond its doors.
In these hours, some of the wealthy chose to indulge in reading, though rarely anything scandalous or emotionally stirring. Novels offered amusement and distraction, but they also served to reinforce cultural literacy and refinement. Essays, journals, and travelogues gave the illusion of intellectual curiosity and expanded the mind in ways acceptable to society. And of course, letters could be composed, formal, precise, and socially valuable, maintaining distant relationships while remaining comfortably removed from the messy realities of human interaction. Music, too, played a role. A piano might be softly played, but only for the calm it brought, rather than for any need for performance. Gentle pieces filled rooms with warmth and rhythm, leaving the wealthy with a sense of peace and control, the kind that only came when the world outside seemed paused. Servants, trained to appear almost invisible, moved quietly through corridors to replenish fires, bring fresh water, or adjust draperies to ensure warmth and comfort remained constant. Their labor was silent, nearly magical and indispensable, though often unacknowledged beyond the occasional polite nod. For some, the bedroom was the ultimate sanctuary. Beds were enormous and feather-stuffed, draped with layers of linens and quilts, perfectly arranged to invite comfort. Sheets smelled faintly of lavender or other delicate fragrances, and pillows were fluffed to exact specifications. Even sleep had its ritual. The wealthy didn't collapse onto mattresses like ordinary people. They slid into an ordered, prepared space where every detail was considered. Nights were carefully curated, extending the control and order of daytime into rest. Yet beneath this calm there was a quiet awareness of vulnerability. Wealth insulated, yes, but it did not remove anxiety. There were always worries about appearances, social standing, and legacy. Letters unsent or invitations delayed could ripple into minor crises. Guests misunderstood, alliances shifted, and subtle failures could fester in polite conversation long after the actual incident was forgotten. Nighttime reflection often carried a tinge of unease, a gentle tension hidden beneath comfort and candlelight. Some evenings were spent in private conversation, carefully arranged with a trusted friend, a spouse, or a family member. These discussions were measured, polite, and restrained, yet they offered a rare glimpse of honesty. Topics included social maneuvering, inheritance plans, upcoming events, and occasionally a brief touch of personal reflection. Humor was subtle, sarcasm carefully managed, and emotion tempered by decorum. Even in private, the wealthy rarely abandoned the careful posture that defined their class. Afternoons and evenings spent in public display were necessary, but nighttime allowed subtle acts of freedom. A wealthy individual might linger over tea prepared personally rather than ceremonially, enjoy the softness of a robe, or read without the need to impress anyone. The household, while still running efficiently, provided a buffer, an invisible safety net that allowed indulgence without consequence. For those accustomed to constant observation, this was perhaps the greatest luxury, solitude within structure. Outside, London remained alive in fog and gaslight. Carriages rattled over streets, distant factory whistles punctuated the night, and the occasional lone pedestrian traced paths in the gloom. Yet within the walls of the rich, all this existed like a distant story, one observed occasionally, but never directly impacting daily comfort. The house insulated, filtered, and softened the chaos into something distant and tolerable. Servants continued their quiet duties through the night. Fires were maintained at optimal warmth, water prepared for baths, and clothing set ready for the morning. Beds were adjusted, lamps extinguished with precision, and rooms prepared for the gentle transition of the household into rest. This silent machinery of comfort, working tirelessly and often unnoticed, was what allowed the wealthy to experience uninterrupted tranquility. Even the act of sleep itself became a ritual. The wealthy might take a brief evening stroll through the house, pause by the window to observe the fogged streets below, or reflect in a softly lit library before finally retiring. They eased into the bed with deliberate care, blankets arranged just so, and pillows fluffed to perfection. The transition from day to night, from performance to solitude, was gradual and deliberate, reinforcing the idea that wealth was not merely possession of material things, but a mastery of time, space, and sensory experience. Night in the wealthy Victorian household was an extended pause. It was quiet, structured, and carefully orchestrated. It allowed for reflection, preparation, and a gentle wind-down from the rigors of social expectation. The city outside rumbled, fogged, and raged, but inside there was control, predictability, and soft comfort. It was a luxury few could truly understand, the ability to live insulated, yet aware, with every detail managed by unseen hands. And when sleep finally came, it arrived in a house that exhaled quietly, dimly lit rooms filled with shadows dancing softly, the faint scent of polished wood and waxed floors, and a pervasive calm that extended from drawing rooms to bedchambers. The wealthy drifted into rest, insulated from the clamor outside, wrapped in layers of warmth, habit, and expectation. The night became a buffer, a soft curtain between the performances of the day and the uncertain possibilities of tomorrow.
In this quiet, the wealthy could surrender fully, if only for a few hours, to the comfort their wealth allowed. No tasks remained urgent, no eyes were judging, no steps clattered on polished floors beyond what was necessary. In the stillness, the complexity of their lives faded into gentle rhythm, the tick of a clock, the soft stir of servants, the flicker of candlelight, and the slow, measured exhalation of a household perfectly run. Tonight, as we wander through this chapter, imagine the warm shadows curling along the walls, the hush of a home that knows its occupants are finally at ease, and the faint echo of a city continuing on its chaotic, fog-laden course outside. For the wealthy, night was both sanctuary and stage, a time to reflect, recharge, and indulge in the illusion that the world outside could be held at bay simply by closing the front door. Sleep, then, was not merely rest, it was another act of control, another layer of privilege, another quiet triumph of wealth over the unpredictability of life. The house exhaled with them. Fires glowed low, clocks ticked softly, and the wealthy, wrapped in comfort, drifted toward the untroubled world of dreams, shielded by status, servitude, and a life designed to smooth the rough edges of reality. Even the wealthiest in Victorian London had a relationship with the end of the day that was entirely different from anyone else's.
While most of the city's population trudged home after a day of labor, soot in their hair and fatigue pressing down on their shoulders, the rich moved through evening as if the world itself had slowed to accommodate them. And tonight, in our final chapter, we follow them through the delicate closure of their day, a ritual that was at once private, meticulous, and strangely theatrical. The household exhaled as the last guests departed. Carriages clattered along the cobblestones outside, fading into the fog as distant lamps flickered. Servants moved like shadows through corridors, resetting the house, repairing the subtle disruptions caused by conversation, movement, and curiosity. A chair slightly askew was nudged back into place, a table polished one final time, a candle snuffed and replaced with a fresh one. The wealthy, insulated from the effort, observed only the results, a home restored to perfection, ready for the next morning, and ready for them to drift comfortably through it. Evening meals had long ended, leaving the dining rooms and drawing rooms hushed except for the faint crackle of the fire. The wealthy might linger over a brandy or a cup of tea, slowly sipping while the household hummed around them. Every movement had its subtle choreography, servants appearing just in time to anticipate their needs, yet vanishing before they were fully noticed. This was the invisible machinery of luxury, a system designed not only to serve, but to reinforce the idea that the world itself existed to accommodate those with money. As the hour grew late, rooms were dimmed and soft shadows stretched along walls decorated with paintings that depicted landscapes, ancestors, or scenes so idyllic they could not exist outside the frame. The wealthy wandered these halls, or perhaps paused by windows overlooking foggy streets. The city below was alive with dimly lit gas lamps, rattling carts, and the occasional distant cry, but the upper floors remained a bubble of calm. From this height, even the chaos of London felt softened, filtered through thick walls, curtains, and the certainty that every discomfort would be managed by unseen hands. For women of the house, often involved reflection or quiet hobbies. A piano might be played softly, a book might be read with a faint smile, or letters might be drafted and corrected with meticulous care. These actions were not hurried, there was no urgency. Even the simplest gestures were deliberately slow, as if prolonging the pleasure of having nothing necessary to accomplish personally. Each movement reinforced the separation between those who labored for survival and those whose survival had been secured by wealth, position, or inheritance. For men, evenings often meant review and contemplation. Ledgers might be examined, correspondence checked, and distant business matters noted in a manner that suggested engagement without requiring any effort beyond the raising of a pen. Some entertained guests in private study rooms, hosting small conversations that were less performance than intimate strategy, though still calculated with care. Every interaction, even behind closed doors, served the dual purpose of maintaining influence and reinforcing the illusion of effortless control. Children, when present, were guided through bedtime routines orchestrated by governesses, tutors, and nannies. Their lessons, reading, and prayers concluded with precision, ensuring they entered sleep both instructed and obedient. Even the youngest members of the household learned early that wealth insulated them from discomfort, but it also came with expectations, decorum, poise, and the quiet acknowledgement that comfort was never without cost to someone else.
The night deepened. Fires glowed low, casting warmth and a faint amber illumination across velvet chairs, polished floors, and walls lined with books. The wealthy might pause in the library, letting the quiet sweep over them. Every clock ticked in sync with the house's calm rhythm. Curtains shielded them from the fog and grime outside. Every layer of luxury reinforced the notion that their world existed precisely as it should, predictable, orderly, and removed from chaos. Baths were another nightly ritual, not merely for hygiene, but as a sensory affirmation of status.
Warm water, carefully scented soaps, and towels heated by the fireplace or warming cabinet all combined to remind the occupant that discomfort had been eliminated. Even personal grooming, hair combed, nails attended to, skin soothed, was conducted under conditions impossible for ordinary citizens to imagine. Luxury was both invisible and tactile, a steady current running through the entire household. Yet, for all the comfort, there remained a faint awareness that life outside these walls was unrelenting. London persisted with its fog, factories, cries, and clatter. Servants who had been shadows during the day still existed, their own lives measured in the minutes and chores that supported the illusion of ease. The wealthy understood this only abstractly, as a distant hum behind their perfection. It was never immediate, never pressing, and never something they needed to manage personally. This separation, this insulation, was the truest privilege of all. As the night grew stiller, the household's energy shifted. Servants retired to their quarters, kitchens cooled, and corridors were emptied of purposeful footsteps. The house itself seemed to sigh, the polished surfaces reflecting only the faintest glimmer of moonlight through drawn curtains. The wealthy moved with deliberate slowness to their chambers, slippers padded softly on thick carpets, doors closed gently behind them. The world outside became increasingly irrelevant, filtered through walls, candles, and the quiet assurance that every need had been anticipated. Sleep in these households was never rushed. The wealthy took time to settle into layers of bedding, each quilt, pillow, and sheet arranged meticulously. Feather mattresses offered support without disruption. The house exhaled around them, fires glowing low in anticipation of the chill of the night. Even as they closed their eyes, the comfort extended beyond the physical. It was the knowledge that the world outside was, for now, perfectly managed by others. Every sound, every temperature, every potential inconvenience had been handled before it could touch them.
And yet, as the wealthy drifted into slumber, the city continued. Carriages rumbled faintly through fog, distant whistles pierced the night air, and the ordinary citizens of London persisted in labor, worry, and unpredictability. The contrast could not have been more pronounced. Inside, luxury, calm, and control. Outside, chaos, toil, and uncertainty. Wealth had created a protective layer, a barrier of comfort and ritual that few could comprehend. Sleep itself became an extension of privilege, a period of rest insulated by servants, structure, and design. Even in dreams, the wealthy often remained within the safe confines of their curated world. The soft light of fire, the gentle warmth of beds, the whisper of servants moving unseen. These elements infused rest with the same tranquility they carried through the waking day. Privilege had extended beyond life into subconscious safety, a luxury unimaginable to the broader populace. And in this final quiet hour, the cycle of wealth, control, and insulation reached its apex. The day was over, the household rested, and the city beyond continued its restless rhythm, unaware of the serene bubble high above the foggy streets. Thus concludes our journey through the world of the filthy rich in Victorian London. From the meticulous rituals of morning through measured afternoons, glittering evenings, and finally into the tranquil embrace of night, their lives were orchestrated to minimize discomfort, maximize control, and preserve the illusion of effortless elegance. They never touched the machinery that sustained them, yet it functioned ceaselessly, invisibly, to protect, pamper, and preserve. In this world, wealth was more than money. It was insulation, a slow rhythm of ritual and comfort, a carefully constructed dream in which every detail, every moment, and every human hand worked to create a life of uninterrupted ease.
And while the rest of London struggled through fog, soot, and labor, the elite rested, perfectly cushioned, perfectly aware, and perfectly untouched. Tonight, as the fires burn low and the city exhales beyond thick walls, the wealthy sleep, wrapped in layers of luxury, silence, and privilege, drifting gently into dreams only they could ever fully inhabit.